Good evening and welcome to the LaRouche Organization Symposium on Friday night. Today is May 30th, and I have a very special guest with us this evening visiting from a great distance in Southwest Asia. And I think what we're going to be discussing is actually very important, which is the situation in Syria, which to my mind is somewhat of a Rosetta Stone if you want to figure out the dynamic of so many things going on in the world. So without saying more, let me bring on Vanessa Beeley, journalist, courageous woman who has spent I don't know how many years in Syria and Southwest Asia as a whole. And Vanessa, as I introduce you, I just want to show people the article that you recently published, which I think is a real bombshell, the Blair Bush project in Syria that brought al-Qaeda to power. Now, many Americans have some idea of this because they know that General Michael Flynn was fired by the Obama administration, supposedly for saying that he didn't think it was such a brilliant idea to be arming al-Qaeda. I don't think we ever got to the bottom of that story or what was happening in Benghazi and where various weapons were coming from. But I'm going to stop there and just let you tell us a little bit about the situation, yourself, the article, anything you want to say. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Diane, and thanks for having me on. Yeah, sort of extraordinary information that came to light very recently. I knew, of course, anyone that's been following the regime change war against Syria that was kind of incubated post 9/11. We can get into more detail about the background to the war itself. But what became very apparent to me was this coordination between Tony Blair and George W. Bush using the war on terror to effectively bring down multiple countries in Southwest Asia to secure the security of Israel. And that project, if you like, began back in 1996. It's to some degree always been a project since the creation of Israel in the Middle East and the Zionist project that was begun by the British and then very much adopted by the United States. But if we go back to 1996 and the Clean Break Doctrine, which was a CIA paper, a strategy paper, crafted at the behest of Benjamin Netanyahu, who, of course, we now know to be leading the genocide against the Palestinians, both in the West Bank and in Gaza. And the Clean Break Doctrine laid out a strategy to effectively reduce the threat to Israel in the region and to fragment and destabilize the countries that might offer some resistance to Zionist expansionism and occupation in the region for the years to come. And of course, what that meant was the war on Iraq, on the false narrative of weapons of mass destruction, but which was effectively the first step in destabilizing Syria, because Syria was seen as the greatest threat to Israel in the region, not only for its history of pan-Arabism and a sort of a socialist perspective whereby they perceived the potential for Arab nations to effectively secure their own resources for use by those countries rather than by resource grab by the Western supremacist and neo-colonialist nations, including, of course, the United States.
Can you
And
hold
Syria was, yeah,
just a minute,
sorry.
because I want Dave to pull up that document that shows the discussion about overthrowing Iraq that you had in the article. Dave, do you see that there, the slide with the yes? If you could, I can't read it, but
No, I
maybe
pretty
you could
much know
read
it
it
by
if you could see
heart.
it. Yeah. So would you
Yeah.
tell us what it says?
So basically, I mean, I'll paraphrase, but basically these were the communications between George W. Bush and Tony Blair around 2003 that were revealed in the Chilcot report in the UK, which was an inquiry into the legality of the war against Iraq, which of course we know to have been unlawful. And basically what Blair and Bush were discussing is the potential for trying to court Syria and to detach them from the resistance axis, to weaponize them against Iraq, and to effectively bring them into the Western orbit of client states. And of course, we know that that entire plan failed. They tried very hard. I mean, in 2002, Tony Blair was lobbying for President Bashar al-Assad to be given a knighthood in the UK. So they did try extremely hard. But if we go to 2006, actually, if we go to 2005, Christiane Amanpour interviewed President Bashar al-Assad, and they talked openly about the potential for regime change. In 2006, there was a Time article magazine, Syria in Bush's crosshairs, in which Bush was discussing the potential for weaponizing insurgents against the Syrian government. And then, of course, fast forward to 2009, when President Assad basically turned down the Western-backed Qatar-Turkish pipeline in favor of a Russian-backed Iranian pipeline. We know then what happened in 2011, the regime change war that had been incubated for a number of years, particularly by the British. French Foreign Minister Roland Dumas admitted in 2013 British officials had come to him in 2009 and informed him that they were going to start funding and arming insurgents in Syria to bring down the Syrian government. So we know from 2009 onwards, efforts were made to basically instigate the regime change war against Syria.
Yeah, I'd like to get to the present, but I just want to go back to add something. In 2010, 11, that was the first time I ever ran for office. I ran for Congress in New Jersey in the 2012 elections. And we had, of course, the very brutal assassination of Gaddafi in 2011. And LaRouche said at the time, he said, this is a prelude for war with Russia. Now, that wasn't so clear to people at the time, but his point was they're going to sweep through Southwest Asia. The targets are Syria, Iran, and they want a flank on the soft underbelly, if you will, of the Russian Federation. And you see how precisely, in effect, that this, now appears. And of course, we know, I guess, that the Rand Corporation had their own report of how many nations they wanted to destroy. But I mean, here we are, in a sense, really. And I think the recent events, or quote unquote recent, everything happens so fast now. Things that happened a few months ago feel like ages ago. But the overthrow, I mean, that Assad finally had to leave, and the group of forces that were assembled to bring that about and how it occurred really shocked many people. I don't feel that at least certainly not in the mainstream media, and frankly, not much in the blogosphere, is there a clear report on what happened. But go ahead. You don't have to go there immediately yet, the steps leading up to that.
Well, I think, what it is extremely interesting for me is how the Blair influence has remained, Tony Blair, throughout the regime change project in Syria, which of course endured 14 years. Until the final achieving of regime change in December last year. But if we actually look at how the British involvement has remained, in my opinion, the strongest intelligence operation against Syria. America, I think, has offered funding and the muscle and brawn in the political diplomatic spheres. And of course, the majority of the Syrian so-called opposition lobbies were US based. But the intelligence operations were definitely incubated in the West. Because if we look at who now, and we'll come on to what's actually happening in Syria right now in the next few minutes, but Jonathan Powell, who was chief of staff under Prime Minister Tony Blair, in 2012, or rather 2011, so just as the war began against Syria, he created an organization called Intermediate, which is listed as an NGO or a charity, but of course, as always, is funded by a number of governments, including the British Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. In 2012, Jonathan Powell sent an email to Hillary Clinton in which he explained the role of Intermediate as being a bridge between governments and insurgents. And of course, in Syria, that
Wait, can
relates
I
to
ask
Al-Qaeda. Yeah.
when in 2012 was that? I mean, before or
Ooh,
after Benghazi? That's what I'm just wondering about.
that's a very good question. I would have to double check.
Okay.
I don't know if I have the exact date. But I know it was at the same time, if you want to check, as Jake Sullivan emailed Hillary Clinton telling her that Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria. So the combination here of Jonathan Powell, who formerly worked with Tony Blair, who with George W. Bush actually set in motion the plans for the overthrow of the Syrian government if they didn't comply with US-UK agenda in the region. And then fast forward to 2011, Jonathan Powell then created this organization that then acted as a mediator between governments and insurgents. I love this kind of sterile word for terrorist proxies, basically. That's what it boils down to. And at the same time, as I said, Jake Sullivan was making it perfectly clear to Hillary Clinton that Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria, just as, of course, they had been in Afghanistan to bring down the Soviet Union. And then if we look at Jonathan Powell's role, that has been identified as effectively grooming from within that terrorist cluster someone who would be presented as a legitimate political challenger to President Assad. And of course, that is Abu Mohammed Jolani, who was also, one could say, incubated in the CIA black sites in Iraq prior to the regime change war in Syria. He was initially a member of ISIS. He led a number of, very violent attacks, particularly even against US forces in Iraq, before he then created Nusra Front, which is Al-Qaeda in Syria. And in 2021, just as an example, we have reports that Jonathan Powell again met with Jolani. Now, at that time, if you remember Frontline, PBS Frontline, Martin Smith did an interview with Jolani called The Jihadist, in which basically Jolani for the first time had his beard trimmed and he was put in a suit and he was given the script that he was going to go from a violent terrorist into some kind of, legitimate political opposition leader. At this time, of course, he was
You
based in
know,
Idlib.
it just
Yeah,
occurs to
sorry.
me that I may be taking the wrong approach in running for office. Maybe I won't say the implications of that, but I've been
Uh,
much too moderate, I guess. Anyway,
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, obviously, I think if you want to run for office, then clearly you need to have a terrorist background. Although, of
right.
course, what did Marco Rubio say very recently that none of the government in Syria right now pass the FBI background checks, which I found extremely amusing as they are a creation of the US and the UK. So I would have thought the FBI knows perfectly well who they are and didn't need to really do their background checks because they'd already sort of dealt with them indirectly in the black sites that were being run by their colleagues at CIA. So anyway,
All right, go ahead. Sorry.
the ridiculousness of some of the narratives that are now being put out there to sort of hide the fact that basically Al-Qaeda has been brought to power in Syria and is being normalized and legitimized by governments across the world. And so in 2021 was the first effort basically to bring Jolani to the forefront of people's perception in the West as a potential replacement for President Assad. And then fast forward again to 2023, and Robert Ford, who was the former US ambassador to Syria, actually, he was very unceremoniously kicked out of Syria in 2011 because the population saw that he was inciting the death squads, he was inciting the insurgents to rise up against the government publicly. And he was mobbed pretty publicly. So he was actually withdrawn from the country for his own safety. And in 2023, as he recently informed a Baltimore Council on Foreign Relations audience, he in 2023 was invited by, he rather coyly calls them a British NGO specializing in conflict resolution, which I think again is a wonderful euphemism for what they actually do. And intermediate, by the way, is jam-packed full of MI6 operatives. I won't say former operatives because I don't think people ever really leave the intelligence services, but including Martin Griffiths. And in Powell's email to Clinton, he's very proud of the fact that Intermediate has direct links to the secret intelligence services, to MI6 and so on. He makes this very clear. And Clinton, of course, is terribly interested in this because this means that she has a direct line to the insurgents in Syria, Somalia, Sudan, and Yemen was the other one.
Wow, that's really
So
big.
this was where he was working, right? And so we're in 2023 now, and Robert Ford had been invited by this British NGO that we have now identified as Intermediate and Jonathan Powell. And Ford was invited to come help groom Jolani. So, of course, he jumped at the opportunity to go and meet Jolani and to basically bring him out of the terrorist ranks into the political ranks as a future political figure for Syria. And bear in mind, this is 2023, so this is 1 year, 1.5 years basically before the final fall of Damascus. And this is why it's very important to look at the timeline. So Ford met with Jolani with Intermediate in March 2023 and September 2023. And then in 2024, of course, we know that leading forward into November when Israel agreed to a ceasefire with Hezbollah in Lebanon at the end of November. And I remember at the time thinking this has gone through too easily. I think Netanyahu now is going to pivot to Syria. And literally before the ink had dried on the ceasefire, so I think the ceasefire came into effect at 6 a.m. On the morning of the attack on Aleppo. And within 10 days, the terrorists had made their way from Aleppo through Hama, Homs, and into Damascus. And I myself was in Hama, Homs, Tartus, and then finally in Damascus as they were advancing. So I had a very much on the ground experience of what was happening. It was incredibly fast. But almost immediately, after the fall of Damascus, we had the entry of British employees of a private military contractor based in Dubai, which is unsurprising. The majority of British-run private military contractors are based in Dubai now. Entered Damascus and were immediately working with the Al-Qaeda unelected regime. And Ford visited again with the same organization, with Intermediate in tow, and a number of the MI6 affiliates who'd been running operations, both media and intelligence and political operations against Syria since 2011, arrived in Damascus. And Ford again claims that he met with Jolani. I do have to say that apparently Jolani is denying that he met with Ford. Now, I'm not quite sure why this is, because I don't actually think Robert Ford would make this up. So I have to raise the question, why is Jolani trying to distance himself? Perhaps because of the connection to British intelligence, and he doesn't quite want it made known that he was both groomed and brought to power by British intelligence with the backing of the US and the Gulf states and Turkey and Israel and so on. I'm not quite sure why he's publicly denying that those meetings ever happened. And perhaps also he doesn't like to be thought of as someone who had to be groomed and basically scripted and trained into doing what he's doing right now, which is complying with US agenda, particularly, of course, on the normalization with Israel, which is something that Trump in particular has been pushing forward. That's been his number one condition on the lifting of sanctions. And he has basically achieved assurances from Jolani that Syria will normalize relations with Syria, with Israel, which is something, of course, Syria has resisted since its freedom from the French mandate back in 1946. And this is an important point, is that the secret treaty between the French and the British back in 1916, the Sykes-Picot redrawing of borders in the Middle East, which then created the spheres of influence for the British and for the French, just before the Balfour Treaty, which of course then brought in the Zionist project to drive a wedge between particularly Egypt and Syria, because Egypt and Syria had previously, of course, been the United Arab Republic. And both Gamal Abdel Nasser and Hafiz al-Assad had been working on this entire pan-Arabist project to unite the Arab nations into a bloc where, as I've said before, they could basically be free to use their own resources, be a sovereign bloc, just as Gaddafi had been trying to do with Libya, of course, to create a pan-African bloc along the same lines. And of course, this is why it was necessary to divide and conquer. And that's one of the reasons for the Zionist project where it is, because it divides Syria and Egypt. But Syria was very important to destroy, because through Syria, actually, the Sykes-Picot lines had effectively been broken. They'd been erased completely because the resistance axis. Yeah,
I want Dave, to pull up that map that was in your article from the Columbia University student, if that's okay, and then people will have some idea perhaps what you're talking about. So,
basically, Syria was pretty much under French control on the western flank and influence on the eastern flank. Britain, of course, had control and influence in Jordan and Iraq and Kuwait, and Russian control actually up there, sort of adjacent to Turkey, and some Italian control and influence in southern Turkey. So basically what had been happening, and of course British control in Jordan, if I didn't mention that. And so what had been happening, because of the resistance axis, which basically went from Palestine through Lebanon, through Syria, into Iraq, and then to Iran, those lines were being completely broken apart. And British influence had been waning to a large degree since 1948, when it had basically turned over Palestine to the Zionist project. And so for me, the British move against Syria was, number one, to reinstate some kind of Sykes-Picot influence for the British in particular. But we're also seeing the French creeping back in, particularly on the coast, and through establishment of dry ports now inside Syria since Al-Qaeda came to power. But also for the British, this was a war against Russia and Russia's influence in Syria. I think almost more than the United States. The British have a very vindictive animosity towards Russia. And actually what we've seen since the British have been moving into Damascus, I was speaking to a friend of mine in Damascus the other day, and he told me, he said, Vanessa, like all the four-star hotels are wall-to-wall British. Literally. I mean, Jonathan Powell is there, his intermediate colleagues are there, and we know from other reports, particularly in French media, who of course would love to expose British involvement in Syria. I mean, the British-French confrontation or competition in the Middle East has again been an historical aspect of the division of the region, of course. And basically, other intermediate employees are now grooming other members of Jolani's government, including Assad al-Shabani, who was with Jolani, a co-founder of al-Qaeda in Syria, and he's now the foreign minister, the so-called caretaker foreign minister. And people may remember that there was a rather awkward interview between Tony Blair, who clearly is back in marking his territory in Syria, having been the architect of the war against Syria with George W. Bush. But he interviewed Shabani at Davos, and Shabani was groomed for this appearance by Lucy Stewart, who's one of the project managers at Intermediate. And basically, you know, what did he do? Everyone is glossing over the fact that Jolani is conducting ethnic cleansing massacres and pogroms against minorities in Syria that include the Christians, the Alawites, other minorities such as the Druze, for example, particularly in the south of Damascus, and even against Sunni Muslims that don't adhere to the Takfiri extremist ideology. And so while all of these governments are rushing to legitimize Jolani, he is conducting ethnic cleansing against minorities, and it's ongoing. It's a settlement project very similar to the Zionist project in the sense that while Trump is insisting that he rids the country of its foreign mercenaries, he can't do this. Because if you look at how Jolani was running Idlib, which of course was his domain prior to the al-Qaeda advance on Damascus, he had a number of the terrorist armed groups under his control, 40% of which were foreign mercenaries, foreign Takfiri mercenaries from all over the world, from Afghanistan, from the Xinjiang, the Uyghurs, from Chechnya, from Europe, from Northern Europe, and so on, and even from America. So these Takfiris were under his control in Idlib with the help of the US. The US was effectively assassinating the leaders of other groups like Haras al-Din that were challenging Jolani's supremacy in Idlib. So he needs these foreign fighters desperately. He can't get rid of them. And plus, he promised them positions of power, which he's given them within the army and the government. He promised them citizenship, which he's gone ahead and done. And he's also, the areas that he's ethnically cleansing, he's resettling many of the foreign jihadists in those homes that he's emptied of the indigenous peoples, including, of course, the Alawites. There's more than 40,000 Alawites now in northern Lebanon that I went to visit shortly after the ethnic cleansing began in earnest, and there was only 10,000. Now there's around 40 to 50,000 in Akkar in northern Lebanon.
And this, I mean, this really isn't known. I mean, we see the role of the American news media immediately when this happened, and somehow there's a jolly New York Times reporter inside the prison talking about liberating everything, as if the media has nothing to do with it. And I have to say, you know, when John Brennan, the former head of the CIA, is now a major anchorman at MSNBC, you cannot avoid that the media, the US mainstream media, is an instrument of this intelligence apparatus. There is no, so that's not just a coincidence. The New York Times journalists didn't have, you know, they're really part of this and creating the perception. It's really terrible. By the way, I wanted to mention, I don't know if you're aware, but Tony Blair actually came in and was an advisor to Barack Obama when he was running for president.
Yeah, I'm sure. Like Tony, you know, Tony Blair through his Global Institute is still, and let's not forget he was made peace envoy for the Middle East, which I think was one of the most criticized appointments ever. I mean, nobody else, I think, has as much blood on his hands as he does. And this is a very serious point, in my opinion, because an estimated, and that's a conservative estimate, 1 million Syrians died in the 14-year war that led up to Al-Qaeda coming to power in December 2024.
So that's just in
And
Syria. I wanted to ask
yeah,
you that. So you estimate it's 1 million people died in
yeah.
Syria during this.
Mm. I
Mm.
mean, 500,000 was the figure for years. But I know in one area alone in Tartus on the coast, and this was about 6, 7 years ago, a soldier from there told me that 72,000 people just from that one area around his village had been sacrificed in the war. And the huge majority of victims were the Syrian Arab Army, of course, who were woefully unequipped, fighting simply to defend their homeland against what was a proxy terrorist invasion that had been brought in from Libya, which, as you mentioned, had just been thrown into absolute chaos, of course, prior to the war against Syria. And this was all the design. Even in the clean break doctrine and in the communications between Bush and Blair, they make it very clear that it's terribly important that Iraq is overthrown. The road to Damascus is through Baghdad. It's very important to put US military bases in Iraq to threaten Syria even before the regime change war began. So all of this was orchestrated from the very beginning. And I think when we're looking at geopolitics, it's very easy to forget to mention the human aspect. And when you look at how the Syrian people resisted for 14 years, it was quite extraordinary. And by doing so, of course, they gave the ability to the resistance in Palestine, the resistance in Lebanon to reinforce and to reach a point where they're capable of holding off the disproportionate force of the Zionists, backed, of course, by US weapons that are
Right,
still flowing into Palestine.
right.
And
Could we, on this point, because I
mm,
think so many people really have no idea of how advanced most of these nations were before these operations. And I know
yeah,
Syria had a very high standard of living,
mm,
very literate and educated population, various science initiatives that have been
yeah.
undertaken by the government. Iraq similarly, very high literacy rate, et cetera. If you could say something about what Syria was like before
Mm.
all of this.
I mean, it's incredibly sad. I saw a post yesterday on Telegram, which I think just summed it all up for me. Healthcare in Syria was free, but even in the last few years that I was there, so even after Trump brought in his first administration, he brought in the Caesar sanctions, which collectively punished any nation that came to the assistance of Syria. So any nation that was prepared to help Syria rebuild would be hit by the Caesar sanctions, which I think was one of the most barbaric sanction regimes ever created. And from 2020, that is what brought Syria to its knees economically and from a perspective of a lack of hope, a lack of dignity in the country for the huge majority of the population. It drove the final stake into Syria's heart, which was very apparent with what happened in 2024. But there was a post on Telegram the other day, and there was a very angry family member shouting because he'd brought his wife in for treatment, and the treatment had been delayed to such an extent that she died because they were asking a huge sum of money to even look at her and treat her. Now, when I was there, even leading up to November 2024, healthcare was free in many cases. And even if it were not free, I mean, me personally, I remember having a couple of health problems and I was astounded. In the morning, I would call basically the specialist in that area and he'd see me at 3 p.m. in the afternoon.
Mm,
And when I went in to see him, he'd waive the fee saying, no, you're a guest in our country. You're not going to pay anything. And I mean, the fee was something ridiculous, like $20. It really wasn't anything to write home about. Do you know what I mean?
right.
But the speed of the healthcare and the quality of the healthcare, even after 14 years of war and the decimation of the entire health sector by war and by the terrorist forces and by the sanctions, because much of the equipment had not been able to be replaced because they couldn't bring in the spare parts, they couldn't bring in new equipment, and so on. And this, of course, is always the effect of sanctions. They're designed to collectively punish the people, not the named individuals, not the leadership as it's always claimed. It's designed to bring the nation to its knees and make it impossible for the state to actually cater for the needs of its population. That's the point of sanctions. They're criminal.
Right.
There
Now,
is absolutely no good reason for sanctions except for boycotting Israel,
of course, it's just, it's so evil. You
Mm,
said in your article, and I was surprised because I didn't realize that the lifting of the Caesar sanctions was only for 180 days,
mm.
pending certain demonstrations of, if you could just go through that, that would be helpful, I think.
Well, basically, yeah. I mean, Trump has lifted the Caesar sanctions, but it's only for a 180-day trial period. And during that time, as I said, Giuliani has certain conditions that he has to meet. He has to expel the foreign terrorists, which, as I said, is going to be extremely difficult for him to do. And he has to take steps towards joining the Abraham Accords, which of course is normalization with Israel. And that, of course, also was launched under the previous Trump administration by his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who created the Abraham Accords to effectively, again, um, follow through on the clean break doctrine, which was all about bringing the region under the sphere of influence of Israel, partitioning, carving it up into smaller statelets where Israel can have a greater role and a greater sphere of influence. And of course, we've seen that with the Gulf Arab states. I mean, Saudi Arabia is to a degree dragging its heels, and that's why Trump has promised it all sorts of defense equipment for the biggest defense contract in history with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. Part of that, of course, is to enable them to protect themselves against any attack by Iran should America and Israel decide to bomb Iran. I don't actually think that's going to happen. But of course, he's enabling the Gulf states to protect themselves because they would be the first to be targeted by Iran in an event of war to decimate the oil industry and to economically put pressure on the United States.
No,
And so
I
these
want
are the
to,
two main terms, sorry, of Trump's pressure on Giuliani.
is there any pressure to stop these ethnic cleansing massacres?
No, none.
Uh,
None. I mean,
I,
if it is, it's very far down the list, but I actually don't. I think he has mentioned it, and I think the British are celebrating, what is it, a transitional justice forum that's been created inside Syria. But I mean, that's the same as asking the Zionists to investigate their massacre of Palestinians in Gaza. It's never gonna
right.
achieve anything.
Right. I'm just thinking, supposedly Israel, this is to Bennett, but Israel will never be stable or loved or be able to live in peace while collaborating with terrorists and others or unleashing them to commit these atrocities. So you do wonder, I'm wondering really the role of religion, this so-called Christian Zionism, these really fundamentalist
Mm,
cults who have these very bizarre beliefs, because you'd say, what really is the point? Is the obsession of this part of the world partly fueled by religion? I know from a sterile British
mm,
standpoint, it is the crossroads, right? It's the crossroads between Europe, Africa,
yeah,
Asia, and therefore they would never want it to be stable because God forbid you don't want these people outside of the empire to be working with each other directly. So you want to create a
yeah,
cockpit for war, but also knowing this whole, British anthropology, behavior modification, et cetera, is to bring crazy fanatical religious beliefs into this to get people obsessed with carrying out a particular agenda, whatever the harm. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think that's one of the reasons that the West, the UK and the US in particular, have been driving or running operations to drive the Christians out of the region. And of course, Syria since 2011 has seen the decimation of its Christian population, and that is now also continuing under the Jolani unelected regime, Al-Qaeda regime. The same in Lebanon. There's been a concerted effort to push Christians out of Lebanon. Why? Because ultimately, of course, this leaves the Takfiri project versus what is perceived as being only a Shia resistance crescent. So from Yemen through Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine. But of course, that's largely incorrect because in Palestine, it's a Sunni Muslim resistance. In Lebanon, it's not only Hezbollah as in Shia Muslim, it also, there are Christian factions fighting alongside Hezbollah. There are Sunni Muslim factions here that sympathize with the resistance. Syria, we know to have been a secular state where there was complete plurality and coexistence between all ethnic minorities in Syria. In Iraq, it's not only Shia, again, it's Christians and Sunnis fighting alongside the various forces that are predominantly Shia. But what they're pushing now is this return to what I call Kabbalah II, where you have a particular branch of Sunni Islam, which is the Wahhabi doctrine Islam, which is an extremist fanatic version of Sunni Islam, which I also call the Takfiri project, which has been run by the British, I think, in my opinion, in Syria in particular. And you're absolutely right. It's pushing, and this is my opinion again, it's pushing towards this final war between Sunni and Shia, although I've explained what I perceive the Sunni aspect to be. And the Christian Zionists, of course, have this vision of Armageddon bringing about the second coming of Christ. And that is what a lot of the Christian Zionists, particularly in America, are very focused upon. So yeah, you do have this slightly insane overlaying of these religious agendas. But coming back to the idea of why does Israel or why did Israel support a Takfiri project in Syria? It was initially to achieve their aims, but if you look at their rhetoric now, they're now rejecting Jolani and saying, but we don't want this on our borders, so therefore allow us to occupy the south of Syria, so we create another buffer zone to protect Israel from these Takfiri elements. And I think that's part of the reason that now you see the British flooding in. And as someone pointed out to me, this always happens, whether it's Iraq or former Yugoslavia. When there's been a NATO intervention afterwards, it's the British that come in to basically clean up. And that's what's happening. So British military attaches have been in Damascus talking to the Al-Qaeda government about taking care of the military and the defense and so on. So in my view, Britain is going to take control of the military in Syria through private military contractors or even through direct military assistance and cooperation, put in inverted commas, and in order to, again, protect Israel, because Israel is perfectly happy if Britain is in charge of it, because that means it's no threat whatsoever to Israel. Israel can expand to its heart's delight. I mean, its vision is to create the David corridor up the eastern flank of Syria, which will give it access eventually to the Euphrates in Iraq. ISIS has been triggered in Iraq to fight the resistance there. But also we're seeing signs of, and this again, I think, is an element of Trump putting the pressure on Jolani by triggering and deploying ISIS factions in the Northeast against Jolani's factions, and also releasing the former Free Syrian Army factions that were being protected, trained and recruited in the Al Tanf, the US military base on the border with Iraq and Jordan. Those forces are now on the eastern flank of Damascus. They've taken control of one of the main military air bases there, and they're camped on the eastern flank of Damascus. So Jelani, in my opinion, Jelani is not going to be around for very long. He can't sustain any kind of leadership in a country of 23 million when he was struggling already in Idlib, but he had the US assistance there. The US has stopped any assistance to him. The lifting of sanctions for 180 days is utterly pointless because what businessman is going to come into Syria and say, okay, I'll invest in the business sector here. Oh no, I won't, because if you don't comply after 180 days, Trump's going to put the sanctions back on. So what's the point?
Right, exactly. It really makes me think of how, in a way, uh, scheming it was of Tony Blair to give that
Mm,
speech. I forget which year, it's saying we have to end the Treaty of Westphalia. We're at the end of that era because the
yeah.
only way in a place like this, where you have so many splintering factions all being armed and played by different groups and switching sides, and is you really have to have a Westphalia approach, which in today's cynical world would seem impossible. But a friend of
Mm,
mine at our recent conference just showed the maps of what happened in Europe during these religious wars and areas where half to two-thirds of the population was killed. And you see paintings of that period where everyone's missing an arm or a leg, or I mean, it was completely barbaric and horrible.
mm,
But nonetheless, after 4 years, it finally dawned on some people that there is no future unless we can draw the line, no retribution. We're not going to look back, and we are going to act in the interest of the other. And I think today people would tend to say, well, no one would ever do that. That didn't really happen. But my own belief, I don't think I could function if I didn't believe that mankind fundamentally was good underneath all of this. People do know the
mm,
difference between right and wrong. And I think that kind of approach also involved in Westphalia was forgiveness of debt and a conception of economic development going forward, which I think is urgently needed in the region as a whole. But I think this cultural question is really important because people, when they're beaten down and dragged down, they just say it's impossible. And what's more important is revenge and retribution. But what are your thoughts about how we bring this to an end? And obviously, the United States has to change its policy. The United States
yeah.
cannot run around saying we're the global hegemon. I appreciate very much what Putin said about polyphony as opposed to multipolarity, because you really don't want competing poles. You really
Mm,
want mankind to appreciate that people have their different languages, cultures,
yeah.
religions, but like an orchestra, there is a possibility of bringing that into a harmonious whole where the diversity is part of the richness of advancing mankind. Somehow
Mm,
we that would have been the idea of John Quincy Adams for sure. And we have to kind of inject this spark of an idea. I think the Westphalia question is very important, particularly including in that how horribly barbaric and brutal the religious wars in Europe were, because people tend
yeah.
to downplay it, I think.
Mm. I mean, first of all, just to address the idea of the downtrodden falling into hatred, because this is something that I'm often asked, particularly with relation to Palestine, because I spent some time in Gaza in 2012 during the Zionist aggression and again in 2013. I don't come across hate. I never came across hate in Syria because actually the culture and the tens, I mean, what is it? Damascus is one of the oldest inhabited cities in the world, if not the oldest, 10,000 years. And so the background of civilization and culture and ideology in these countries is actually not hatred. The hatred has been brought in by the British and the Americans through the Takfiri project, through this extremist fanaticism that is based in racism and supremacy, very much like the Zionist project. So who's injecting hatred into the region? It's actually us speaking collectively in the West. And that's a very important point to make. The hate would almost immediately dissipate once that pressure is off. Do you know what I mean? Because
Yes.
the hatred
It's
is
unnatural.
being, yeah, it's completely unnatural. These people, are here in Lebanon and Syria, hatred is kind of way down the scale of understanding for them. Iraq was not a sectarian country before the West got involved. Many Iraqi analysts have spoken about that it was maybe politically and classist. It was just like any country, really, but it's not naturally sectarian. Yemen is not naturally sectarian. The Zaydi and the Shafi, which are the equivalent of the Shia and the Sunni, coexisted perfectly well together. They shared mosques. There wasn't this sectarianism, which is then exacerbated by the British and the Americans in tow to some degree, introducing these elements that literally breed hate in the area. They sow hate, they sow revenge, right? So once those elements are actually destroyed and removed, and the West stops funding them, and by the West, I'm talking about the EU, the US, the UK, and their allies in the Gulf states and so on. But once they're deprived of resources, they can no longer exist at the level of hatred and violence that they currently do, because they're being kept alive by our regimes in the West. So I think that's an incredibly important point to make, because Orientalism, which is a concept of the British, was designed to imprint this image of people of the region being irrational and savage and fighting amongst themselves. But if you look at Palestine pre the Zionist project, Sephardic Jews, the Jews from the region, the Middle East Jews, were living absolutely peacefully alongside the Palestinians. I mean, to a wonderful degree. And the same in Syria, there was a big Jewish population in Syria. And actually, when they left, their homes were turned over to the refugees from Palestine. That's a little aside, in the old city in Damascus. So I think I agree with you. Sometimes it's very difficult to believe in the goodness of mankind when you're consistently on a daily, hourly basis faced with the ugliness of mankind. But that ugliness is manufactured. It's both manufactured and it's being kept alive through those whose image is being reflected by the ugliness that they've created. So that means the people in power in our countries. And that's what people, I think, need to understand, that what is happening in West Asia or in Palestine is related to us. I remember when Trump was about to be elected and people were arguing with me on social media, yeah, but Palestine's only one issue. Do you know what I mean? So this was their excuse for electing Trump, because I was saying to them, the genocide it's not going to go away. It will increase under Trump, because look at his administration. And I think what's important for us as human beings is to understand nothing is one issue. It's all connected, from former Yugoslavia through to what's happening now in Syria, what potentially is going to happen in Iran, what's happened in Yemen. All of this is connected, and it's all being engineered and orchestrated by the same people, by the same conglomerates. And once we understand that, I think we can start campaigning to do something about it if we stop seeing it as separate issues. And I think that's my only real advice. The resistance can take care of itself. Palestinians, and I speak because this is what Palestinians have told me over the years, they don't want to be in a situation where they're reliant upon aid. They want to be self-sufficient, right? So it's not a question of aid. Aid becomes a big discussion, but actually take away the process that is putting them in a position of needing aid. And then suddenly they can take care of themselves. The Yemenis have been under war for 10 years, and they are the ones doing the most damage to Israel economically,
Right.
right? So this is the resourcefulness and the resilience of this region.
Right. And I
Leave them
think,
alone and they will rebuild. They don't
right,
even need your investment in the rebuilding process. Just leave them alone, take the pressure off them and let them rule themselves in the way that they want to do so. Give them the freedom to make that decision. And that's what we failed to do.
right. Well, there's not an interest, but I really appreciate
Yeah.
this, particularly these points. I think it's absolutely right. Similarly with Haiti, where now we're talking about an
Mm,
OAS for, it's absurd.
mm.
It's to ignore the entire history of a nation and a people and
Yeah.
the contributions that they've made and the recognition that they have, in a sense, their own talent, their own
Yeah.
geniuses, that if they are allowed, because again, it's the natural, human beings would like their children to grow up in peace and have
Yeah.
a chance to become geniuses in a sense. So how do you create
Mm.
the conditions for that? I so agree. I would ask if you have some final thoughts that you would like to say, and then I have just some activity to announce of the LaRouche organization. So go ahead.
No, I think no real final thoughts. I just think we need to remember that it's humanity that's under attack right now. This is something that I feel very strongly. And the resistance isn't just, the protests and the demonstrations. It is the armed resistance. I'm not a supporter of war at all, but we have to support the ability of these people to defend themselves against what is tyranny and oppression. And I think this unification idea of actually recognizing that we are one humanity, in that degree, mentally erasing the borders that separate us, whether that is ideological borders, whether it's geographical borders, and start recognizing that we need to unite in order to face the common threat.
I thank you very much. So on October, or not October, June 17th or so, there's a big conference planned at the UN. It was already pushed back. It's to discuss the France-Egypt plan for reconstruction of Gaza. And as you may know, Vanessa LaRouche put forward way back in 75 this proposal called the Oasis Plan based on massive desalination, modern transportation. There are certain aspects of the Egyptian plan. I mean, of course, they say the Palestinians remain, they want to build new modern cities, etc. But if you don't have energy and you don't have abundant water, it's going to be very hard to sustain. So we are planning a lot of activity by the UN around June 17th. And I would say if people watching this are interested in helping us to bring the really big ideas, the universal ideas to everyone who's involved in these negotiations, please email the LaRoucheOrganization.com. Please sign up so that we can be in touch with you and you can join with us then. And otherwise, I want to thank you very much for joining me. I think this has been so important. I think Americans particularly are very naive about the role of the British per se. And here we are in the 250th anniversary of our republic. And I think the British have never given up trying to make us in their image. And unfortunately, we're acting like it at the
Yeah.
moment. Yeah, so thank you very much.